It's a goal. Who got the assist? Who got the assist?
Hello everyone, we're back after an interesting weekend in the Premier League where weak and strong performances alike for FPL managers led to high highs and low lows as the season progressed into the double digits. Let's go then, I'm Tom, I'm here with a tentative beer today. I've picked up a really annoying sort of piddly cough from either work or from my daughter via playgroup, so having beer I'm sure is the way to get through these things. It's the time-honoured tradition, and also potentially drinking a little bit to forget the game week just gone. Yuck. Anyway, I'm joined by Sam as always. You all right?
Yeah, all good, thanks. Got down to Southampton over the weekend, so watched one of the better Southampton performances in recent years. So I was quite happy with that. First time at St Mary's this year too. So that took my mind off of FPL a little bit. Didn't go too great on the Saturday, and as we'll discuss, FPL was a bit meek for both of us this week, although not a total unmitigated disaster. So I'm not in too terrible a mood for the pod tonight either. We are Who Got the Assist. The mini league is finally closed. So congratulations if you wormed your way into it before we closed it off, but we did give everyone a fair bit of warning. Game week 10, I think, was a fair shut-off point. So good luck to all of you that are in the mini league for this season. There is a trophy on offer come game week 38. So fingers crossed for all of you out there. On today's pod, the main topic is going to be on overmanagement, which is quite a prudent topic to be talking about at the moment, I think, with all of last week's fighters, or at least most of last week's fighters from the pod blanking, with some of the players that were sold off en masse were the Spurs boys, for instance, all returning. What is this condition that is overthinking that impacts FPL managers and how we can ward against it? Bold claims, as always, we'll be doing. And then a listener Q&A. We've got quite a few good listener questions at the end of the pod to look out for as well. We're recording on the 30th of October. The game week is over. So without further ado, I'll hand back to my co-host, Tom.
Yes, indeed. Right, let's get this out of the way. Scores on the bloody doors. So I think you are first, so it gives me more time to just wallow and keep drinking.
Yeah. Drink away, Tom. My week wasn't great either. 64 points for me. It was a red arrow. I'm down to 695, so just inside of the top 700k now. After two good green arrows, I was due a little bit of a correction, I think, probably. So brought back down to earth this game week. I don't think it was a disaster by any means. I think I was maybe one return away from it being at least a grey, possibly even a green arrow. Obviously, I sold Maddison for Saka, both getting 6 points, so absolutely fine there. Son did get the goal and the maximum bonus as well. I was quite lucky that Spurs conceded in the end because I had a doggy, didn't play, whereas a lot of other owners had Porro, for instance. But that also took Son up to the 3 bonus points as well. So that was a really good swing for me, but could have easily gone the other way. Was never really considering captaining Haaland away at Man United, but possibly should have been looking at that a little bit more closely. But Salah with the fairly lucky goal against Nottingham Forest, not bad. But overall, 64 points, not a great week, but definitely not a disaster. So I'll take that one and move on to game week 11.
Yes, indeed. Well, the swing did go the other way for me with Porro, but I did predict it, didn't I?
You did.
I said it exactly. He said, I said, Porro's on probably on bonus now. I'm sure that someone like IU is going to score a pointless goal in the 90+ minute, and that's exactly what transpired. Yes, that wasn't a prediction I enjoyed seeing come to fruition. I think that kind of set the tone for the week, really, because yes, that did elevate Son to 10 at that point. Before that happened, I think Porro was on 2 bonus, and I was kind of thinking, I've sort of covered it here. I think it kind of just continued on downhill. So my moves in the end were, as said last pod, because I'd already done them, Kulu, Alvarez and Son out for Martinelli, Watkins and Maddison, choosing to keep Trippier over Son. So that's kind of 14 points scored by the guys who went out, 11 points scored by the guys who came in. Martinelli denied, but I could say by Fotheringham, and also created 3 chances in the game, but sadly got subs for Trossard. So yeah, there's always going to be that going on. So kind of a -7 overall with the transfers if you include the -4 taken. I mean, I think I'm just a little bit sort of like, oh God, because I feel like I was a little bit impetuous, and I feel like I probably should have considered Son staying a little bit more, because now I kind of think that maybe it should have been Trippier who went. I should have taken those points and ran, like one of the YouTube commenters said a little while ago, rather than kind of continuing to keep him. So a bit of a headache going forward, and also there are charges of overmanagement against me, mainly brought by myself. But I'm not by any other body. I refer myself to the independent WGTA body to arbitrate about overmanagement. And since this is a week where I guess the pro template is to roll for a lot of people, I think it's worth kind of just spending a bit of time, I guess, thinking about overmanagement in FPL. Because Chris asked, with blanks for Watkins and Saka, who recorded 0.06 XGI, that was Saka, of course. Watkins missed two glorious opportunities very early on. I'm pretty sure one of his shots was like 0.91 XGOT. So only Watkins. And so Chris asks, was the rush to Watkins and Saka last week a waste of time? And I suppose in the context of transfers some people made, including myself, selling likes of Son, Maddison, the guys who returned, as you said earlier on, Sam, it's worth mentioning this. So over management, I guess, is the idea that sometimes it's better to do nothing or do minimal stuff rather than make big, heavy moves to smash you forward, because more often than not, it actually smashes you in the arse. I mean, you're quite a notably safe manager. Has befallen you in the past, or is it something that you've kind of done in the past and now kind of completely just got over?
Yeah, I mean, I've definitely done it in the past. I think I'm yet to meet an FPL manager with several seasons under their belt who hasn't fallen victim to overmanaging at certain times. And a lot of it can often get coloured by the outcome rather than the decision making. Sometimes we get away with overmanaging because the outcomes actually favoured us. So it's important to note that overmanagement doesn't always necessarily lead to the outcome we might deserve, which would be obviously quite negative if we have overmanaged. And sometimes we forget about it a week later and double down again because the result has actually favoured us. One really good example I can remember from my personal history was, I think it was 2 years ago, when Son and Kane were both at their absolute height, but it was one or the other that was doing really well at any given moment. So I think at the time I had Son and Kane was smashing it. All of a sudden there was just a patch of fixtures where Kane was just bagging a brace every single week. And then I thought, oh, well, I need to sort of realign. I need to shift focus across to Kane. Sold Son as part of, I think it was as part of a -4, if I'm honest. And then immediately the pendulum swung back in the other direction. So that was probably the worst example I can think of that comes to mind, but I'm sure there are other examples that have probably gone against me, and then other examples where I've overmanaged, but I've forgotten about them because the result has actually not hindered my overall FPL performance. But that doesn't mean I wasn't overmanaging at the time.
Yeah, I think Lucy did exactly the same thing. I think she was complaining about that when we had on as a guest a couple of years ago. Absolutely. I mean, I remember this was back in 2017 when the pod first started. I sold Salah when he was away at Bournemouth for that hat trick for a -4 because I had other plans. I wanted to get Kane in. Salah was an unknown quantity at the time. And I thought, oh, yeah, no, I wanted to just kind of shore up my team a little bit. I think I had some bench issues and I wanted to buy Arnautovic. I seem to remember I wanted to buy. So I sold Salah for a -4 against Bournemouth. And then he proceeded to score a hat-trick. And most of the game owned him. And we didn't really know about EO those days. But it's definitely a case just over managing because I could have just benched. I think I had a player injured. I could have just benched, had a 4.5 million midfielder at the time come off the bench for 2 points and roll the transfer. I should have done that. And that's the sort of thing that kind of, I guess, came to mind a little bit. I mean, it wasn't that bad a punishment this week, -7, but I am looking at it a little bit. And yes, I know there's obviously kind of the sepia-tinged smooch of hindsight perhaps coloring me. But I still think to some extent that maybe if I slept on it a little bit, just let that kind of rise happen and try to kind of look for other alternatives when we got to Friday, that the Trippier replacing Trippier instead of Son may have kind of happened, because there is a sense of kind of, now I don't have Son, which is something which is quite difficult if you do have Son to kind of get your head around. Now I don't have him. There's a real sort of palpable sense of FOMO, especially and we'll talk about this later on, that I think the template is now hardening a little bit. I think there's certainly players who people are kind of settling on and thinking, well, you know what, I'm just going to leave this guy here. And I think removing a member of the set template was perhaps not really the best call. Yes, these are never the pods that I enjoy, but hey, what can you do? So that's over management. What triggers it, Sam? What triggers over management? I think there's definitely kind of a few things, aren't there? The first one this week, the rush to Watkins and to a lesser extent Saka, as Chris mentioned. Like there's always this sort of, I guess, urge to bring in a player if he becomes a quote unquote need for the next few fixtures, or at least a big fixture like Luton at home or something like that. And that can necessitate, I suppose, removing performing players whose fixtures may be hardening. Like, it wasn't just me who made ugly transfers this week. There were quite a few people, weren't there?
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the comments on my own personal YouTube today was talking about selling Alvarez this week for Darwin. So it seems like Darwin's now the it thing for this week. And it just goes to show every single week there's a new it thing. There's a new hype player that's being talked about quite a lot in, whether it's Twitter, X, or whether it's in the YouTube comments or just in content creation around FPL at the moment. The narrative shifts so quickly and becomes really embedded in the way people are thinking about their moves. And I think it's important to note that just because a player isn't being talked about that week doesn't mean they're a bad pick. It just means that probably a lot of people who would have otherwise been talking about him have already got them in. So maybe they don't need to be talking about him quite so much anymore. So Alvarez being a good example this week. But last week, if we're focusing on the Spurs assets, both Son and Maddison were still going to be good picks last week, arguably are still moving forward pretty decent picks as well. But you won't see too many people mentioning them outside of the realms of, can we get rid of them? It won't be these are great picks to bring in right now, because most of the people who were interested in them in the first place have already got them in. So I think it's about making sure that you don't let the narrative of wherever you're consuming content, whether it's on this podcast, whether it's on YouTube, whether it's on Twitter, X, don't just take that information. Also think about, why aren't people talking about other assets? Alvarez won't be talked about much this week because those of us who don't have him probably aren't going to get to him now, because they've got Watkins, they've got Darwin.
Yeah.
But that doesn't make Alvarez a terrible pick at home to Bournemouth. That's a fantastic pick to have. It's just that he won't be a massive buy for many this week, because a lot of people have already sorted that position or already own him and therefore aren't going to be talking about him. So that was the issue, I think, last week with the Spurs assets in particular, and possibly to an extent Trippier too. And Saka was one pick that had been injured for a little while, coming into a good run of fixtures. So everyone's going to be talking about him and the Arsenal assets. So it felt like there was this big groundswell of momentum building. And I think for you as well, Watkins was another good example. I would probably put him in a slightly different bucket to Saka in particular, because he also had been returning consistently in the previous weeks. So there was more than just the narrative bias. Whereas with Saka, I think it was this groundswell of information. Everyone's talking about bringing in Arsenal players ahead of Sheffield United. I think it could have gone nuclear. It could have been a much bigger score, but that doesn't make the Spurs assets a bad own. And that doesn't mean you need to get rid of the Spurs assets and all of a sudden they're going to stop returning. It's just, I think a lot of content creators out there probably were thinking the Arsenal assets can probably outperform them in the next couple of weeks. That doesn't mean the players you've already got won't do well, though.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, there's definitely, whenever you make like a lot of the time, the ideal moves you want to make are the ones which are kind of straightforward, obvious ones, I think. And this week was definitely one which wasn't straightforward and obvious. And I think you're right that there's definitely the fact that the ongoing sort of question is going to be, when can I remove these Spurs players, because there's other players who are going to come through. And, you know, there's always that sort of the nature of the outcome. So if Porro's 8 had come in, I wouldn't be upset, I don't think, or I'm not upset because I've got a life, but I wouldn't be like thinking about it reflectively, because I don't think, like, because some would have been matched by Porro and I'd be thinking to myself, oh, you know, I've covered that. That's okay. And you mentioned earlier on, you know, you've maybe overmanaged yourself before, and maybe you did it, but you forgot about it. That's because it's that outcome bias, isn't it? Or as it's known in poker, resulting. And the idea that when you achieve a good outcome, you assume it's because you made the right decision and the process was optimal. When you achieve a poor outcome, you assume you made the wrong decision, your process was off. And these things actually, like, even though it's a good thing that you had those occasions where you may have overperformed, you may have overmanaged, and it's kind of done well, and you kind of think, oh well, whatever. That can sometimes be a bad thing as well, because you can kind of conflate luck and skill. Like you can kind of think to yourself, the outcome is literally just a skill thing, and your process was optimal. And on the flip side, if the outcome is negative, you can kind of think to yourself, oh, you know what, like, I've completely messed up. My process was awful because the outcome was bad. And I think sometimes that's kind of the difficult thing as FPL managers, if we're being reflective, how we sort of balance that up. Like, is it always just my transfers went well, therefore my thinking was good? Or is it the case that sometimes that you think, oh, you know what, you're always open to things going wrong? And for me, I think that my problem is not so much the outcome, it's more that I'm not comfortable with the thought process. And I think when I was listening back to the pods last Tuesday for just our clips and things like that, I could definitely kind of tell that I wasn't particularly completely comfortable with the move that I made, put it that way. And I think that does make me think I've overmanaged a little bit, and the kind of obviously I'm always a little bit skeptical at the start of every week, Sam, as you now have learned. But I think this week especially, I was particularly skeptical about the move that I made, and I think obviously the Porro, the Spurs losing the clean sheet kind of reinforced that a little bit. But yeah, there's I guess so. First trigger for overmanagement can be kind of a player becoming a need for the next few fixtures anyway. The second one is kind of this 0.0 thing that everyone sort of loves, me myself included. When I was wildcarding, I was banging on about having a 0.0 draft that I really liked, and that sort of drove the decision to make the wild card, and that sort of drove the decision as well to think, oh, you know what, this is my last chance to do this, to get these players in. I'm gonna go for it now. And I think that kind of brings another thing, which is action bias. That sometimes you feel compelled to act because it feels like you're missing a huge opportunity to secure a certain sort of thing, in this case a certain setup. And I mean, do you think kind of sometimes this kind of drives a lot of transfer behavior activity as well, because people see your players going up on, say, a Tuesday, they know that there's a European game or a cup game on a Wednesday, but they'll make the move just because they think, oh, I'm at 0.0, I've got to do it. I feel like that's such a huge driving force sometimes, isn't it, in our behavior?
Yeah, not even just in FPL as well, but you're a man with a young kid. Soon enough, you're going to be buying them toys, and you take that toy away from them, even if they don't want it at the time. All of a sudden, that's going to be their favorite toy immediately, and it's very similar with the 0.0. If you've got to make a move tonight, if that opportunity is going to be yanked away from you the following morning, it makes you feel like, oh, I'm going to be missing out on this huge opportunity, as you say, if I don't act now, when actually maybe it might be more sensible to let the opportunity slide because you're not fully convinced that it is the best move for your team. I think it's a tough balance to get, because often a lot of moves get made at both the start of the week and at the end of the week. So most of the price swings will happen when everyone's still a little bit like raw with emotion from the game week, or right at the end when you've had a lot of time to analyze all of the European fixtures, or the midweek cup fixtures have been out of the way. But by that time, all of the early movers could mean that you've got yourself priced out of a move that you wanted to make. So moving early does have its benefits, but I think you need to be very, very sure of those moves going into the week. If you're going to make a move on a Sunday evening or a Monday, whilst those prices are still fluctuating quite rapidly at that time, as we have discussed on this pod before several times already, I tend to leave my moves quite late because I prefer the information over the extra 0.1 or 0.2. Even if it means that I'm going to get priced out, I need to be super, super convinced that this is the move for me to make that move early in a week. I just get burnt too often by these things where a player gets injured midweek, or I feel like I've been pressured into a move, and by the end of the week, with more information, I feel like, oh, maybe I could have seen another opportunity down the line. And I think that might have been what happened to you this week a little bit. But I wouldn't want to put words into your mouth.
We spoke about this, didn't we?
It's tough to balance, though.
We definitely spoke about that really early, didn't we? About like very start of this pod about kind of this season, sorry, about lessons learned and the Austin rule and things like that. And I did say last week, this is you only can do this once or twice a season, and it's quite funny that this has sort of been the one which is kind of completely not blown up in my face as much. I'm not talking about kind of a massive sort of huge swing. Like a friend of mine, Neil Gupta, he got to, I think his swing was like -47 or something from selling Haaland. So yeah, right. It's very. I think he sold Haaland and ended up kind of benching Wilson, and it all got very, very messy indeed. All of those sorts of things. So I mean, it's not as bad, but still, it's kind of worth talking about. So. Triggers for over management. We've got player becoming a need, that 0.0. I think you said something really interesting there about kind of feeling emotional post the game week, and that can actually be positive or negative. I think, like, negatively, you've got that kind of almost masochistic urge, haven't you, to kind of just do something, sort my team out. I'm done with this. I've seen enough of this person. I don't want him in my team anymore. I'm getting rid of him. I'm sure those people have had that with Mbeumo, the likes of Sterling this year. But I think for me, actually, what might have happened, Sam, was that I had a couple of really good weeks. I'd halved my rank twice, and maybe I'd kind of gotten a bit. There's a bit of overreach, maybe. Like I was doing well, and it was kind of like. I was kind of almost
in the groove.
Maybe overconfident in my decisions. Obviously, that's very kind of subjective and outcome bias driven to some extent. But I think, sometimes that too should kind of be, you should kind of take a moment to think about those sorts of things as well. Like, yes, it's great you're doing well, but you've also got to kind of come back to a norm, or kind of come back to the sort of sense of a grounded shavasana about where you are and what you're going to be doing. Just because sometimes, you can, I do think over management can sometimes be that you've maybe gotten a bit overconfident, because I think every year, especially the years when I've done badly, which is for those listening for a long time, probably about the last sort of 4 or 5 years before last year, there was always a moment where I was doing pretty well, and then I do something like this. Luckily, I think this is fairly early in the season, so I think it's probably all right. But where I've kind of got to a certain point, I've made like a big call, like on a wild card. I've removed, I always say, don't throw the baby out the bathwater on a wild card. That's exactly what I've done in the past, like remove performing players on the late wild card, for example, and found myself being absolutely destroyed by those players continuing to perform. So, I mean, I do think that you can get that kind of, you can kind of be swept along on a wave of your own hubris, effectively, sometimes in FPL as well. If you're doing well and you kind of think, oh, you know what, I'm fine, I'm just going to do this, so it's fine, especially in the emotion of having a good game week. I mean, sometimes as well, it's a good thing, isn't it, to kind of step back, even if you've done well, and think, actually, I need to just kind of take stock and think a bit more.
Yeah, absolutely. I think in basketball it's known as the hot hand fallacy, I think, where you just assume that because the last shot went in, the next one's going to go in, then the next one's going to go in next. And decision making in FPL has an element of randomness to it, as an element of luck to it. There is skill in making the right decisions, but the outcome is luck driven. So for you to think, not you in particular, but any FPL manager to think that I'm going to keep getting these decisions right and it will keep paying off, I think you can't equate one with the other. You can keep making the right decisions, but you can't guarantee that those are actually going to result in a positive outcome every week. You've just got to make sure that the process is a sound one. And I think sometimes when you've had a number of good outcomes in a row, even if the process hasn't necessarily been correct, and this isn't to say yours hasn't been, by the way, I think you've definitely done the right thing recently, but in general, if the process hasn't been correct, but the outcome has been correct, maybe sometimes that overconfidence can come into your thinking. You think, well, basically everything I touch turns to gold at the moment. I'm definitely making the right decisions. The process must be good because the outcome's great. So therefore, I'm just going to keep going with my gut, and I'm going to keep following further down the rabbit hole of crazier and crazier decisions that are going to prove me to be the FPL genius of all time. That's not what you've done here. I think you've seen a play through Martinelli in particular as an opportunity. And I don't think that actually your decision making was necessarily that bad on that, but you've been punished. And I think the process may come under the microscope, but I don't think it's the worst one I've ever seen. I think my example with Son Kane years ago was way, way worse than that. And I got punished duly. And in a way, I'm thankful I did, because I remember it and I remember not to do that. But I think in general, if anyone's out there listening and thinking, oh, I'm not sure about my process recently, even though the outcome's been good, or the reverse, just focus back in on the process, whether the decision-making is that, whether you're doing it on eye test, whether you're doing it a stats-driven decision-making process this season, go back to what you believe in, figure out on paper whether or not what you've been doing in the last few weeks has actually got sound reasoning behind it based on the way you tend to play the game. And just see whether or not you've started maybe drifting away from that process, whether or not your solid foundations are slightly shifting to try and catch the next big thing just for the sake of it.
Absolutely. Yes, I couldn't do a bit myself. And I think the final thing, so a player becoming a need, 0.0 coming up, you need to buy that player straight away, and maybe an element of overreach if you're doing well, with just emotional effects on you. I think the final thing might be boredom. Yeah, you definitely see that a lot. People going, oh, I'm bored of this. I'm bored of my team, not performing great or whatever. And it can sometimes happen. Like if you had the same team for a while and you've been sort of cruising, not really been getting massive highs, but maybe not necessarily getting low lows either. And you feel like you kind of come into a subpar week, you may think you want to kind of just change it up. I think this is especially true now. The templates I mentioned earlier on is kind of hardened around a few kind of players who most people are going to own. They're Haaland, Salah, Son, Saka. I'd probably say those four. So the next few weeks, you're going to be there's going to be a lot of kind of moving the deck chairs around the Titanic, isn't there, as it sinks? Because there are going to be loads of moves you don't really need to make. Like I was doing some messing around the FPL.team, and I looked at your team actually, Sam, and we spoke about that as well, didn't we? A couple of days ago. That I looked at your team and thought, wow, I with your team, I don't really need to do anything for quite a while. And I think that in some ways that's almost a battle in of itself, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And you've looked at my FPL team at the moment. I'm having that worry myself right now over, well, surely anything that I do now is just going to go wrong, because I could move out a good asset quite easily in the next couple of weeks for what I believe to be another good asset. But the player that I'm selling could easily pop off and the player I'm buying could easily not. So yeah, I've got 2 free transfers at the moment as well, which just tempts me even more to do something more substantial with my team. So it's difficult to hold on to those 2 free transfers. I wouldn't go as far to say as I'm going to burn this week. I know that there is at least one move I want to make, but I am trying to calm myself down a little bit, make sure that, especially after a red arrow, that I'm not trying to just chase the pack just that little bit too much. And out of boredom, I've seen the same front 7 now for 2 or 3 weeks. Do I want to mix it up? Do I want to move out a player just because they blanked once or twice in the last 3? I'm not so sure that that's a great idea. So yeah, boredom could easily strike if you've seen a player in your side for a couple too many weeks and they're not quite hitting the heights of maybe some other shinier picks, for no good reason other than just maybe some bad luck. Maybe their finishing boots haven't been on the correct feet that week. Then you never know. You could end up overreacting based on boredom more than anything else. And that's something I'm really trying to guard against this week in particular, but also probably for the next couple of weeks ahead as well.
I wonder if in some ways the goal is to manage ourselves into irrelevance. Like maybe that's what the actual challenge of FPL always is, just building the perfect zombie team. Like over time, just doing that. And yeah, I completely feel what you're saying. And it's kind of a bit galling really that my decisions this week have meant that what I now perceive to be the optimal team for the next little while, I can't get to. And it may well be the next week, the outcome becomes that actually the players I bought in do all right. Martinelli
Yeah.
does something, and suddenly I'm like, oh, okay, that's great. And suddenly I'm thinking, oh, I've got a really low end differential that everyone's going to want. It can turn really quickly like that. I'm definitely not all doom and gloom. But I think, yeah, you're completely right that fighting the demon of boredom with your team is something that you'll need to watch out for, especially if you've got the sort of team Sam's got, which is quite, really kind of suited to the challenges of now. So, overmanagement, what causes it? A player becoming in need for the next few fixtures, that 0.0 sort of moment, feeling like you're doing too well or not doing well enough, the emotional sort of impetus and boredom. So what do we need to watch out for? I think there's definitely kind of sell-in performing players. I think again about doing that. Maybe I should be more Sam, which I probably will be for a little while, but we'll talk about that in a second. And I think there's also, Sam, the sense of kind of confirmation bias coming in a little bit. So, we all know confirmation bias. Two things. One is kind of finding information to backs up your point. And the second thing is finding information and discarding it basically if it doesn't suit your narrative. We've all done it. So we're trying to find a reason to bring in a particular player. We might find something that we don't like, but we probably ignore that, to be honest. You may not realize you're doing it. It's a non-conscious thing, but you're going to be doing it. That's for sure. By the way, it's not subconscious because you're not asleep. It's a non-conscious thing. So yeah, I mean, I suppose that's something that always happens, isn't it? That when you're trying to cycle through and find the information that you want, you do sometimes think, oh, that's a bit annoying. I'm just going to ignore that, don't you?
Yeah, especially like now with all the different data points that we've got to go off of, there's millions of different narratives you can spin based on one of 1,000 different data points that are all arguably valuable in their own way. I think the important thing is to try and narrow down to pick the needle from the haystack, as it were, and pick a few key data points that you like to rely on with certain positions. So if you're massively into your XG, XA, then really hone in on that. See if you can create a process every week where you almost measure a player's merits based on those statistics in particular. I'm not saying that those are necessarily the ones to go for. There are 100 different data points you could pick from, but just as quite popular examples at the moment. I think if you're leading a more eye test based decision process, it's easier to have that confirmation bias as well, because there are so much goes on in 90 minutes, including several things that will never even pop up in the stats, like offside goals, for instance, or a pass that gets cut out at the last man. Ollie Watkins, for instance, great example over the weekend where Lockyer bins it into his own net. If Lockyer wasn't standing there, Watkins taps it in for a 0.99 XG goal.
He might have missed that as well, to be fair.
He could have.
I own him now, so that's sort of
That's true. Yeah. Actually, everyone should probably sell him at this point. Let's be honest. But yeah, so like all of these things with the eye test, you can easily. It's impossible to remember the whole 90 minutes, and it's even more impossible to remember the whole 90 minutes of every single match this player has played for the last 2-3 years. So you're going to miss something, and confirmation bias is going to creep in with just a purely eye test driven approach. That's not to say eye test is bad. I think you just need to try to color your opinion with the stats, but make sure that the stats are, again, not cherry picked to suit your narrative as well, which we've all done it a million times, and it's almost impossible not to in certain places, because there are just so many different ways you could look at the data. Even if we're looking at one piece of data, let's say this season Ollie Watkins for once is overperforming his XG, I could easily turn around and tell you, well, that means he's a lethal finisher this year. Whereas you could turn around and just as rightfully say that, well, that's going to revert to the mean over time. That is not going to be sustainable. He's going to drop back down to one goal every 2 games, which is about his XG, what his XG is saying. And both of us would have a fairly decent case, a good narrative to spin there. But again, that's just 2 different stories that we're telling ourselves based off of one data point. So it's very easy to just get caught up with this confirmation bias. And I think trying to nail down a very strict and consistent process in a decision making in picking a player is really crucial to try and alleviate that as much as possible. But I'm very conscious in making sure that I'm not saying that you're going to get rid of it altogether, because I don't think that's actually possible unless you literally just play off of FPL review, for instance, and make all the transfers that way.
I can see why people do it, just because it's complete objectivity, isn't it? I favour a more kind of what you're saying in terms of like, it's an integrationist approach, isn't it, of kind of putting the two things together, and that's exactly how I'd sort of say. But no, you're right. It's one that is always very difficult to get away from. Hopefully, us doing contemplate is a good kind of way for you to hear both sides of a particular argument too. So hopefully, you can always hear voices which are pro and anti what your decision may well be, and which hopefully allows you to kind of gain some objective space when you're making decisions. So yeah, think about selling performing players again, give it a bit more thought, maybe you sleep on it. Confirmation bias, try to be aware of it, and always ask yourself, can I just do nothing here? Or can I roll one transfer like you did last week and just keep your two transfers going? And that sort of thing's very good and something to watch out for. Final bit. So you think you probably overmanaged. What do you do next? So I think we've kind of already started kind of pulling at this thread a little bit. And as you said earlier, Sam, focusing back in on your process is really important. Like trying to adhere to a process, whatever that process may be it data, or integrationist. I think for me, I couldn't really, if you said to me, right, can you write down and codify exactly what your process is? I'm not sure I could quite do that. I think there's a lot of it which is kind of what I feel comfortable doing, and what I feel like I can stand behind. I think where I kind of feel like I've let myself down relatively, because this is FPL, I don't really feel completely upset or anything like that, but where I've let myself down a little bit is that I clearly didn't feel comfortable about the decision that I'd made, and I think that is kind of what prompted me to think about this pod today. And I think there's never really a right and wrong about it. It does seem that quite a slow and steady terse approach to FPL does tend to be the one which most people have adopted, but there's other examples of people who have been quite maverick throughout the years and done well. So there's never kind of one way to play FPL, but it always comes back to kind of making sure you're comfortable with the decisions you're making and you're happy with the decisions you're making. And if you're not happy with them, then maybe it's a case of trying to figure out, like I have the luxury of doing with a podcast, exactly where you've kind of where you've lost the path with your decision making process. I think that's key, isn't it, really, Sam? Just feeling comfortable with what you've done.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we're quite fortunate, really, that we've got a place where we can actually chat out what we've done over the previous week. This is actually probably a pretty crucial part of my process now, week to week, to really help me figure out where it all went wrong the week before, or if it went right, why it went right as well, which is rarer than I'd like to admit at the moment, but we'll get there hopefully. But yeah, it's really important to try and narrow in on what that process is. That doesn't necessarily mean it means it needs to be massively scientific or anything like that. It's just the way you interpret football. How do you feel comfortable with managing your team? And just make sure that you're consistent with that week to week. You're not just wildly spraying from, I'm going to be purely looking at eye test this week, and then next week it's but the data is completely different, so I'm just going to go based on data, and then the week after that it's I'm just going to follow the next it thing on X, because those are three different approaches. If you're going to be consistent about it, you'll probably be getting more fruitful returns, and you'll leave yourself less open to taking massive hits to try and overcorrect the following week as well, because these different processes have quite different players in mind each week, and different ways of playing the game. If you end up wildly spraying from one to the other, you'll probably end up having to take hits most weeks to get across to the other path that you've diverged from weeks before, and you'll probably need 3 or 4 players in that you weren't even considering before. So yeah, I think consistency is key, but that's not to say it needs to be a massively scientific thing. It can be as little as note down the 3 players that are top of your mind at the end of a Sunday after watching some matches, and then has anything changed by the time you get to the Friday? If so, why has it changed? Can you actually work out some logical reasons why your thinking has changed? Or is it just because time has passed and you've seen a bit too much on Twitter, or YouTube content creators, for instance, have talked you out of a move without you actually disproving that it was a good move in the first place? So yeah, there are different ways to skin this cat, as it were, but I think just being consistent is the key here.
Yeah, I think you put it nicely earlier on. Like, there's always this sort of potential pitfall that you can fall down the rabbit hole of doing more and more mad stuff. And I think that kind of is something that's definitely happened to me in the past, where hits became quite moreish to try to sort of get that sort of chase the dragon almost, and get that sort of big result which would kind of solve everything, kind of a bit like kind of gambling effectively. Sometimes it can be kind of a case of maybe taking your finger off the trigger a little bit. And if you are a hit-friendly manager, though, like that one bad outcome shouldn't mean that you should change kind of what you feel comfortable with. And it's always kind of, as a flip side of the outcome bias can be that if you have a bad outcome, you can abandon the process which has worked for you in the past. So that's something again to kind of be mindful of. But I think if you have overmanaged, one thing that I guess from my experience to do is to kind of exercise patience a tiny bit. Like, you're not a bad manager if you're engaged, and if you listen to this, I assume that you've got some level of knowledge, probably more than me, to be fair. And it's unlikely you've made a super punty, panicked move. Like, that move could well come in, so I'd definitely give it a few weeks. But that always again comes with a balance, which is keep an eye on sunk cost. So you don't kind of build that sort of sense of sunk cost about a certain player. I feel like he's my boy. I've put loads of time into defending him, mental energy into kind of justifying why he's a good pick, speaking to other people about him. Don't be afraid to kind of reverse the transfer. So if I do get Son back, it's gonna it may be something I kind of take a bit meekly, but I'll do it if that's for the best. So yeah, I mean, it's I guess refocusing on what your process is, watching that you don't sort of abandon that process entirely, and yeah, maybe a sense of kind of, I guess, learning from it a little bit. And I think not making moves as well, as we kind of mentioned earlier on, when you're feeling a little bit emotional, good or bad, about a game week, is probably again something to kind of be borne in mind. But yeah, no, that's overthinking, over management, and hopefully something taken from my admittedly not created experience, but still kind of a bit of a taking a bit of a dent. That's what I've taken one for the team. So hopefully from my experience, you can kind of ward off the demon, which is over management. But hey, there we go. The pro template, as I said earlier on, this looks to be a bit of a roll week for many. The next few weeks, in fact, are looking pretty decent for a team many have landed on. So I suppose, Sam, it really is a good week to be discussing over management, because in theory, as I mentioned earlier on, teams like yours are so set for set and forget right now.
Yeah, generally speaking, I think you're right. There are obviously teams out there at the moment that probably need a few more moves. So don't let this pod put you off if you think you're not well set up. But I think the nature of the fact that most of us have wildcarded in the last few weeks, but whether that was all the way back in game week 7 like you, 8 like me, or 10 was quite popular as well. I think a lot of us were setting up specifically for this run of fixtures. So again, it's probably worth noting that we're going to naturally have some quite nice fixtures to come for a lot of our players, and they're in our squads for a reason. There are some pretty template picks in there at the moment as well. They've become more and more template across that period of wildcarding, as more and more managers have flocked towards this combination of maybe 4 or 5 picks in particular. I think you mentioned Haaland, Salah, Son, Saka. I'd also add Watkins into that as well. Has become very template recently. And then Trippier is probably the 6th. And I think most managers who have wildcarded in the last 3 or 4 weeks will have 5 of those 6, whether that's you're sacrificing Watkins and you've got Trippier, or you're sacrificing Saka and you've got both Trippier and Watkins, and all of these different combinations. If you've not got Haaland or you've not got Salah, you've got all of the rest, plus maybe some other really quite interesting picks as well. But yeah, generally speaking, I think it is probably, for most of us, a pretty decent time to be rolling in the midfield and up front. I don't think there are too many moves out there that need to be forced in the next couple of weeks. In defense, there might be 1 or 2 for me personally, and there are some pretty interesting fixtures coming where they're playing each other and they're both good attacks. So I'm a little bit hesitant about that. I think game week 13 and game week, is it game week 11 and 13? There's some interesting ones where there's matchups coming, and I think it's 13 in particular. Where is it? Spurs play Aston Villa, and there's all sorts. We'll get to that in a couple of weeks' time. But defensive transfers I'm more interested in, but generally speaking, I think looking at the midfield and attack, I think it's rolling with it for now.
Perfect. All right, let's move on to bold claims. I don't think did either of us do any points last week?
No, we did not.
No. I went Mac Derby decided by 1 goal, which was a no. And what did you go for?
I went Solanke double-digit haul against Burnley.
Oh dear.
Which did not go too well.
Let's move on quickly.
That was a stink fest. So my bold claim this week, I'm going for double digits again. I don't know why I'm doing it to myself. But not for Solanke this time. I'm going for Mbeumo to add salt into the wounds of all sellers, including me, over the last few weeks, and get his 3rd double-digit haul in a row against West Ham at home. I don't think it's the best fixture in the world for them, but West Ham's underlying data defensively has not been great so far. They look a little bit in a little bit of a bad state at the moment. I don't look
malaise
fantastic.
There, isn't there?
There's something. I'm not quite sure if I can put my finger on it, but is that 3 back-to-back losses now in the league? I think. So I'm going with Mbeumo to continue his good run of form, and Brentford to pick up another win probably, but more importantly, double digits for Mbeumo in particular.
Yeah, 4th worst defense for XG now. Wow. West Ham. Yeah, gone on the radar because many of us have got Mariola. Yeah.
Who would have double West Ham defense? Hey, that would be crazy, right?
I wonder where your transfers are going to be this week. Right, and then my one, I am sunk costing, leaning into my own failures. Martinelli to score versus Newcastle. Kieran Trippier caught on the hop, and Martinelli to make him pay. Either that or Trossard to make him pay after Martinelli gets subbed. But yes, Martinelli scores versus Newcastle is my bold claim for this week. Cool. All right, Q&A time. Continuation of this. What we were talking about earlier on, we kind of started touching on it a little bit. Hindu Monkey, the template now looks very, very strong, with most squads having 8 or 9 of the same starting 11 each week. Yet differentials continue to shine, such as Wilson ending Nketiah this week. Shout out to Praz. Is it worth gambling, or would your advice be to simply sit in the pack during this strong template period? Interesting one. I mean, I suppose it's always about kind of trying to scam for opportunities, Sam.
Yeah, always have your ear to the ground. I think there are some picks that you probably don't want to be betting against at the moment, just because not only are they template, but they're template for a reason. It's they're template because they're getting a lot of points and the data's good. So the 4 or 5 that we mentioned earlier, again, Salah, Son, Saka, Haaland, are all going to be pretty good picks. You might back against one of them. I wouldn't back against more than one of them. But then that still leaves you with plenty of positions in your 11 that you can have a little bit of a differential flavor to, especially if you're going for something like a 3-4-3. That 3rd striker spot looks very open to interpretation at the moment. You could be looking at Darwin, you could be looking at Wilson and Nketiah as well. That 4th and 5th mid as well is an interesting selection point. I mean, a lot of us have Mbeumo, Mitoma, Diaby, but there's nothing against going with someone completely off the wall there, or in the 5th spot as well. Adingra obviously is Adingra is obviously the flavour of the week after our touting last week on the pods, thanks to Fran. Didn't return this week, but was pretty unlucky not to do so. So there are definitely opportunities out there. I just think, as always, it's trying to figure out what is just a bit of a 1 week hope to hit, and what has a little bit more longevity to, because you don't want to leave yourself in a spot where you have, like we've been mentioning all pod, overmanaged, and in a week's time you're thinking, I need to get rid of this player again because it just isn't going to work out. But yeah, there are opportunities there, and I think outside of maybe 4 or 5 pretty obvious picks right now to have in your side, there are definitely positions that you could have a bit more fun with.
Absolutely. I think I suppose going forward, you've got quite a set defense, and that's not really going to be the place. I mean, yeah, a little bit of reshuffling now. If you're in the position like you are, Sam, where you're just kind of making sure that everything's optimized. But yeah, for the attack, there's always going to be one player. So say, you know, as I mentioned before, Haaland, Son, Salah, Saka, around that, there's always going to be one or two players you can kind of mess with. So say, I don't know, Bowen, I think, is probably crept into the overall template at the moment. So this week you had Bowen blanking in a fairly sort of pathetic West Ham performance against Everton, whereas those who had Diaby flourished because you had double-digit haul there. And it's kind of finding those moments or those sort of gaps where there is a spot of contention where you can make things happen. I mean, you might kind of, you know, with Saka having low XA or XGI last week, you may think to yourself, right, for the Burnley game, maybe I do want Martinelli if Martin does do well against Newcastle, which I obviously fervently hope he does because I own him. So there's always going to be ways and means around it. I think that there's definitely a case of just making sure that your arse is covered effectively, because that's what's always going to happen. I think, you know, there's always going to be a necessary realpolitik to make sure you've picked the players who are scoring loads of points and also highly owned. I think that's just kind of what can happen in FPL. You've got to cover your arse. But outside of that, there are always ways and means to make a difference. I'm happy to sit in the pack sometimes and just look for those opportunities. We're not going to be taking on the captaincy. Maybe this week, actually, there is an element of that because those people don't own Haaland. But a lot of the time, you won't be taking quite taking on the kind of the upper echelons, or there won't be the big bang when you're taking on bigly owned players, highly owned players. But there is always going to be one or two players that you can kind of make a battleground of each week. So that your dice men are probably going to be kind of reduced a little bit potentially to one or two, right, versus 4 or 5, and that's just the nature of how things go in the season. Like, things get soft, things get hard. You know, I can keep going with that analogy, but I'm not going to. Right, next one. Some bloke called Nick, who apparently used to co-present this podcast. I can't remember him. There's so many co-hosts, and he says, "Can we revisit the mid-range mids for a bit?" He's looking at Diaby, but he recognises that's due to recency bias, but he also recognises there's last week's fighter of Matoma, last week's pods start at Dingra, Gordon, Palmer, and Bumo in the mix, as well as Bowen. Who do we prefer amongst those sort of cheapies or slightly cheap kind of individuals in the mid-price mix in the midfield? I mean, it's definitely one. I suppose that is one of those battlegrounds, isn't it? When you're really looking at it and thinking, hey, you know what? If I get that one right, I'm going to be doing well. I think that there's got to be. I've just got to kind of shout out how bloody well Brentford are doing. They're in the top 4. They're in the top 5 for XG this season, and Bumo is 4th overall. Admittedly, obviously, we couldn't really miss this week, and there have been kind of a few kind of significant misses. There were a few significant misses really early on in the season, which is probably fueling where he is in terms of the overall XG. But you know, definitely a player who's got multiple points, multiple routes to points. FPL General was saying on his pod today. Maybe it's him. I mean, how are you feeling about Gordon at the moment? That's probably a good thing to ask you, because we both own him, and he's maybe one that I'm thinking could well end up being moved out eventually.
Yeah. So Gordon for me is a player that at the moment is walking a little bit of a tightrope. I think Newcastle is still a good side. They had a bit of a blip against Wolves. They have looked a little bit leggy. But Gordon is pretty much nailed into the side at the moment, especially with all the injuries around Newcastle. So I still expect him to tick along, but the fixtures aren't great. It's now a run of fixtures, I think, where it's the home games are all the hardest games they're going to have. So Arsenal this week, Chelsea and Man United are both home games in the next 5 as well. And then I think the 2 away games are Bournemouth and Everton. So obviously great to have him for those. The home games, I wouldn't be scared of Man United at the moment. Probably not too scared of Chelsea. Arsenal might be a bit of a battle. But again, he's under 6 million. So he's very much an enabler. And if he gets a return every other week, then I would call that a win. So I'm not going to try and paint him with the same brush as the likes of Mbumo, Diaby, Matoma, because they are an extra million. That is a pretty handy sacrifice. If I could get to them, I'd prefer any of those options over Gordon at this point. So if we're putting them in the same pile, then I think Mbumo if we disregard the fixtures, comes out on top. The data is absolutely fantastic, and he's on penalties. If we're adding in the fixtures, it probably becomes a little bit messier, and I might end up putting Mitoma one rung ahead. But Brighton themselves haven't looked fantastic recently. I think with Diaby, I'm a little bit wary of being overexposed to Villa when their fixtures run out in a few game weeks' time. And because I've already got Watkins, because I've already got cash, feels like a lot of eggs in one basket at this point. If I already had Diaby from 2-3 weeks ago, I'd definitely be holding on to him. But I don't think I'd necessarily buy him now unless I knew that I had absolutely nothing else going on in my team for the next few weeks. But yeah, Gordon, bit of a thin tightrope, but not really too bothered about holding him for the next couple. After Bournemouth, I might reassess if he continues to flatter to deceive. But I'd probably put Mbumo and Mitoma as joint top, maybe just favouring Mitoma based on fixtures.
Yeah, I'd probably do that as well. I think there's been an element of faith being shook in Bowen too. He's 12th overall for a non-pen XGI at the moment, which is still good. 4 shots in the box, I think General said this week. They weren't particularly great shots though. That was an awful game. It was a waste of 2 hours of my time. And my daughter actually fell asleep during that game. That's how bad it was. And I almost joined her, to be honest. It was awful. So West Ham really need to sort themselves out soon. Or Bones, due to the chop as well. And answering him to Monkey's question again, that could be a time when you do kind of do something different. So there you go. You mentioned Brighton. Nave Jacobson asked, is it time to rethink Brighton? They seem to be struggling with European commitments, or is this overthinking, or should we go with the fixtures? So, I mean, Brighton still doing pretty well, just below Bournemouth in terms of that team XG. They're 6th at the moment overall. Matoma, something 20. I'm going to say he's kind of in top 30, I think, for XG or something like that. Even Evan Ferguson and João Pedro, people are kind of looking at them as well. But it does feel like Matoma will bust until West Opinion gets back with them, just because you can't be sure of the minutes, and the risks are writ large really with João Pedro. And with getting even Evan Ferguson in, because you're not really going to be sat there buying dunk, are you? So yeah, I mean, it's really a case of a Matoma and a Dingra, and again being very open to the fact that he is priced as he is for a reason. It feels more of almost an enabler pick for an Adingra or Matoma if you're in the situation like Nick is, where you're looking at mid-range mid and thinking, well, all right, let's just go with the fixtures. The fixtures are very good. There's no getting around that, and they're good for quite a while. I think the top of both the clean sheet or defensive metrics in terms of the fixture tickers, and also top for attacking. Next 3, Everton away, Sheffield United at home, and Nottingham Forest away. All good games, especially that 1 in 12 against Sheffield United is quite juicy before they come into Chelsea and Brentford, and then Burnley at home in 16. So, feasibly, you could be all right with a Brighton pick. It's just, maybe that the extra labour involved with the extra midweek game is weighing on them. De Zerbi said this team is used to playing once a week, and now it's playing twice a week, and it's quite a difficult transition.
Yeah, it is, and we often see this with European sides when they're breaking in for the first time. But I think with Brighton, it's important to note that we need to almost recalibrate what our view of Brighton is. I think for quite a while, especially at the back end of last season, we all got maybe a slight bit carried away and started imagining them as a top 2 or top 3 side, when actually we all know that they're going to be somewhere between 5th and 8th or 9th as the 5th or 8th. 5th to 8th best Premier League side, which is still fantastic. That is absolutely brilliant. And especially when we look at how they are going forward, how they are in attack, then the price points of these players are more than fair. They're very, very good value for money. But let's not get carried away and pretend that they're on the same level as Man City, Arsenal, or possibly even Spurs at the moment in terms of how talismanic these assets can be and how valuable they are to our side. They're cheaper for a reason. And Mitoma at 6.5 million, I still think is fantastic value for money. What we expect from a 6.5 million asset should not be anywhere near what we're expecting from the likes of a Saka or even a Bowen at near enough 7.5 million now as well. So I still think that Brighton can provide a great option in our FPL sides. It's just recalibrating exactly what we expect of them. And I think a lot of people are disappointed about the blip against Fulham. They were the better side. I think they were very unlucky not to win that game. And again, any side finishing between 5th and 8th, 9th in the Premier League is going to drop the odd point here or there against a slightly lesser team at certain stages during the season. But then next week, they could easily go and blow a team away 5-0 because that's the Brighton that we know. Like they
5-1.
can, or 5-1. Yeah, more likely 5-1. Yeah, you're right. You're completely right. But yeah, that is the Brighton we know. They are still going to drop points here and there. They're not the perfect side. They are fallible. But that doesn't mean they're not going to be really good for us in FPL and they're not going to be a good Premier League side. It's just let's not get carried away and think that they're just going to blow teams away 3 or 4-1 every single week because it's just not going to work out like that in the Premier League. We only remember the big ones, and Brighton will get a fair few of them still from now until the end of the season. So don't give up yet.
I think what's good about it almost is that it kind of helps narrow down the option set. Because there are too many sort of asterisks about Brighton at the moment that if you don't own a Brighton player, you don't need to get an Adingra as an enabler, or you're not kind of thinking, oh, I'll get Matoma now. Like if you don't, then you've got a reason to but buying Brighton. Yeah. So it kind of just helps with the decision-making process a little bit. It may be, as Sam says, that they become unignorable because they get a few of those sort of big results. But as it stands, it's one of those that I still enjoy watching them. I still enjoy sort of thinking about potentially getting a Brighton player in. But at the moment, kind of there isn't that compulsion to get one. I still think Matoma's ownership is pretty high from game week 1, but the engaged ownership wasn't as high this week, for example. And it may well have been, again, that if he did kind of go off against Fulham, that this week we'd be like, oh, how do we fit Matoma in? And you've just got to be aware of that. But as long as they stay quiet-ish, it kind of just helps making decisions going forward. So it's not too much of a bad thing, really. Right. Next question. I'm going to combine these two. Dave sees at FPL. Can I get a rundown of which defenders for the best fixture between now and I think we'll go for game week 16, please. He's got 2 flags and Tarkovsky in defence. An FPL Death Star. Any opinion on Shimikas as a Liverpool defensive option now? Is he nailed enough for this good fixture run, or are Liverpool as dependable defensively? So we spoke about Shimikas a couple of weeks ago, didn't we, Sam? And said, we're not entirely sure how he's going to be used yet, so maybe it's worth getting that kind of information. Liverpool did record a clean sheet, a rare clean sheet, this week against Nottingham Forest, of course. I think that's their 3rd clean sheet of the season. 2 clean sheets in a row after Everton as well, and they're now 5th in terms 5th from bottom, that is, in terms of XG against. So in terms of Shimikas, I feel like he's definitely a player at 4.5 who should probably be top of the list for just getting those cheap players in on some corners. He's not going to be kind of getting you those big scores. Probably you could get lucky and get an assist and get a clean sheet and off you go. But other than that, I mean, it's kind of looking like we're kind of around sort of Matt Cash, an Arsenal defender. Well, maybe Gabriel was all the way rage, wasn't he, last week? But this week, yes, maybe not so much anymore. And maybe still people have like a doggy or something like that. I mean, there's definitely a bit of shuffling to be done in the defensive sort of area, isn't there, Sam? And who have you got your eye on?
Yeah, Tsimikas. It's got to be at the moment, hasn't it, really? 4.5 million is a treat for a top team. And even though they're not keeping a million clean sheets, there aren't many other sides in the league at the moment that I'd back for consistent clean sheets over the next run. So knowing that he is that cheap in a good team with great fixtures, I think is enough. And he did get 90 minutes over the weekend as well. So I'm pretty happy with my process on Tsimikas at the moment, considering I've got that 4th defender spot. So I don't need to start him every single week. And when he eventually does become an issue, when Robertson does come back in January, maybe, then I potentially also have a week or 2 to figure out what I'm going to do with him, because I've also got 3 other starting defenders. So I think he's top of my list for me at the moment. A couple of other teams out there with good fixture runs until around about game week 14, 15. To answer the question, Crystal Palace have a good fixture run for the next few. I think the problem I keep coming back to for Crystal Palace at the moment, even though the fixtures are good, I think they're really struggling at the moment because of their more advanced injuries. So injuries in their attacking third means that the pressure just sort of keeps coming back onto their defence every 5 minutes or so. So I feel like that's why they're going through a little bit of a blip at the moment, and it doesn't fill me with tons of confidence, but I think considering the fixtures, especially in the next 5, if I just read them out, Burnley, Everton, Luton, West Ham is probably the hardest one there, and then Bournemouth. There's got to be a couple of clean sheets there at least, surely. So you could go for an Anderson, you could go for a Guehi. The other one, if you fancy something really crazy, but he has picked up a little bit of traction, is Man United and possibly Harry Maguire at 4.2. I kind of don't really fancy it myself because Man United have just fundamentally not been great, but 4.2 is pretty cheap. He could get his head on something at a corner. He is starting at the moment. Who knows how long that will continue for, though, by the way. Maybe you could look at Man United, but it's just not convincing for me. What about you?
Yeah, yeah, that's a bit of a, if you need money, then sure. I mean, I could go there. I could find myself going there. You never know. I think it's got to be Shimmikas at the moment. I think Guehi's probably the one that I would have said if you don't really fancy that, or you've got some concerns, or you're making up a couple of moves. Palace 9th for expected goal against, so that's 9th from bottom. You know what I mean? And yes, to reflect your point, they're 5th from bottom for XG because they've got no players to attack, which is why bloody Ayew scoring a wonder goal is not exactly what we wanted. Yes, Anana and Lerma are fit, so they've got the defensive screen. It's just what they do going forward and keeping the ball away from their goal. There's not very much they can do about it. I think Lerma can play a more advanced role potentially, but Elise and Eze being out has definitely kind of hamstrung them a bit. But we're at the point in the season, aren't we, where Roy will be looking at those games and thinking, if we can get 0-0, get a goal, that's kind of what we're going for. But a lot of that's going to be about inviting pressure onto the team because the Burnley game, the Luton game, and the West Ham game are all away. So they're going to be inviting pressure in those games. And the players, apart from West Ham, are not essentially the most kind of creative and players that I'm going to be fearing going to be scoring. But more chance equals more chances of goal, basically. So I think maybe it's going to be Shimmikas, and maybe just hoping Liverpool's defensive unit. McAllister looking actually quite good in the defensive role. Maybe we'll go with that one for the time being. Penultimate question, sticking with Liverpool, FPL Janino asks if Darwin is worth our time now with his improving X-Mins and actual returns as well to boot. So Darwin is 8th overall at the moment for non-pen XGI, and as you may expect in terms of non-pen XGI per 90, he's top. He's above Erling Haaland. 7.4, I think he is. 7.4.
Yeah, he is.
So if you're in 3-4-3, I think he'd definitely be a player that you'd be considering. Maybe even not sure you do it this week because I'm assuming you've got Alvarez, I'm assuming you've got Watkins, but a player you really need to be keeping an eye on, I think, and maybe a player that maybe when you can kind of get bored of Watkins, or you kind of think, after Bournemouth in 14, I think it is, they've got Man City and Arsenal back to back. Maybe that would be kind of where the natural jump off would be for Darwin, but there's definitely some sort of mileage in going for it. And maybe kind of going back to Hindu Monkey's question, a player like him could be a good kind of buy if you're looking to kind of challenge the template a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of my bold claims for the season was 20 league goals for Darwin, and it's not looking great so far, but a run of starts and he could net 4 or 5 in one game at any given moment.
Easy, yeah.
I love him. I absolutely love him. He's one of the players that really genuinely excites me when I watch him, and that is for bad reasons as well, but that's part of the chaos and that's part of why I love watching him, because it could end in complete capitulation or with one of the most amazing things I've ever seen.
Newcastle.
Yeah, exactly like the Newcastle game. And I think that's why I enjoy football, for moments like that. So Darwin, I absolutely love. I'm never tempted to buy him in FPL because I'm not convinced that he'll get the minutes. However, in the form he's in now, I'm starting to question that logic a little bit. I'm starting to think that actually he probably is the centre forward of choice for Liverpool now. He's probably not the first name on the team sheet, but if he's fit, he's probably getting the team built around him a little bit all of a sudden. And the form, if it continues, I see no reason to take him out other than potentially at times give him a rest, which will happen once or twice. We will have to bake that into our viewpoint because they do have 5 very strong forward options across that front 3, and he won't get 90 minutes every week. So if you can kind of bake that into your thinking and you still think he's good value for money, which by the way I do, especially if you're in a 3-4-3, he's a player that I'd highly recommend having a good look at in the next couple of weeks.
Yeah,
but I wouldn't sell Watkins or Alvarez for him this week. I would not do that this week. I would, despite the fixture against Luton, it's a great fixture, but Watkins and Alvarez are still both absolutely fine. And to revert back to the theme of this pod, I would be very worried about overmanaging just to try and get the perfect player for this week. When actually the two other options that a lot of us already have are absolutely fine to own for this week and could easily outscore him. We'll revisit him in the next few weeks, but yeah, I mean, if you've got him already, you're loving life. Yeah, he's a great pick.
I think there's definitely a couple of kind of things to consider about Darwin as well. One, if you don't own Salah, he could be a way to cover Salah in inverted commas, because if you look at Salah's how he played with Darwin this week in particular, maybe it's tactical, we don't know, but very, very sort of, he was literally was running down the wing, to quote the Liverpool, to quote the song that Liverpool fans sing about Salah. Whereas like last week against Everton, Darwin didn't play, or he didn't start. But then the week before that, Salah scored the brace and Darwin did play the full 90. So there is always this risk, I guess, with Salah in terms of his overall position being affected by Darwin. So one to keep an eye on, I think, depending on the opposition that Salah's facing, that it could mean that Darwin does become almost a better pick than Salah in some games. Potentially some of the quite easier games on paper. You may see this against Luton as well, that Salah turns provider more for Captain Chaos. So he could be a very good pick, especially if you're a no Salah owner looking to kind of find Nimrod into the Liverpool attack. Because as you mentioned, Sam, the team does seem to be being built around him, or at least kind of tailored to Darwin's strengths at the moment. That does include Salah becoming a bit of a supplicant for Darwin. So yeah, very exciting. If you can get there, it's a lot about kind of team state, as you've kind of spoken about a few times. What's the point if you do own Watkins, do own Haaland? It's not worth it this week, frankly, and you have to kind of just take it on the chin. And the ownership is low enough. I know people hate this, but the ownership is low enough ish, and that you can probably avoid him. But yeah, he's one that we definitely come back to, and there may be kind of a widening sort of discussion about him going forward, even for us in the 3-5-2. Maybe we may end up kind of looking at 3-4-3 because of Darwin, how well he's doing. Is definitely on the table. That could happen. All right, final question this week. Rolling into transfers and captains. Dave asked, who do the no Haaland brigade captain this week? Should they be scared? So I guess they captain Salah. Yeah, you got to.
Surely. It's got to be Salah.
Or the other one I was thinking of was just chucking it on Alvarez and just hoping that he matches, because it could well happen any given day. You could find that Haaland and Alvarez match each other, because Bournemouth are no Man United, are they? They're better than that. So we'll have to see. But yeah, it's got to be Salah. So I think that by consequence, you probably see Salah again nudging the 100% sort of effective ownership sort of mark, if that's something again you're into. But yeah, I think if I didn't own Haaland this week, based on kind of how he performed against Man United, I think I would be quite worried. I don't know if you kind of relent on your strategy, because at the end of the day, you do have Salah to cover. You may potentially have Alvarez to cover. And after this, you've got Chelsea, Liverpool, Spurs and Aston Villa coming up for City. So maybe you're kind of thinking, oh, you know what, I'm going to jump back on Haaland. After that, I think it's Luton, I think I'm right in saying. So I think that would be maybe the time you jump on Haaland again. This is kind of the week that I guess you'd have known this is all going to come if you are on the no Haaland kind of strat. So should you be scared? Potentially, probably. What could happen. I'm pretty sure this week there were probably a few green arrows dented or red arrows made worse by Haaland going off against Man United. I think that's probably the summary there. And we're both on to move on to transfers to captain, Sam, on Haaland, aren't we?
Yeah, I'm definitely captaining Haaland. Let me just get my team. I'll start off with my team actually, and we'll go back
Yep.
to yours. So yeah, I'm captaining Haaland this week. No question about that whatsoever. It just to answer Dave's question a little bit from my side as well. The way that the question was pitched is as if they should be worried about who to captain. I think Salah's a great option for captain.
Yeah,
but
definitely.
if you're captaining Salah this week, then it probably means you don't have Haaland whatsoever, which means you're very exposed to whatever points he gets, because he will be 160, 170% EO. So you'd probably be a little bit fearful for that, but I don't think the captaincy is necessarily a worry. There are universes where Salah could outscore Haaland against Luton. It could definitely happen. It's just they'll be even more exposed on whatever Haaland scores than those of us with Haaland captain probably also already own Salah, so we'll be maybe slightly exposed to a 110% EO Salah, for instance. So we have to mitigate against that extra 10%, whereas the non-Haalanders just simply don't have him whatsoever. So this is the week that they probably are the most worried, but I don't think go against that. I don't think you have to rip up your team to switch your strategy. You've picked this strategy for a reason. I'm sure that the logic is very sound and you can keep moving down this path. This is just the 1 week that you probably aren't really looking forward to quite as much. But the other weeks, it can work out, and arguably it has so far. So no reason to divert from the path now. So back to my team. Haaland captain, Salah vice. It's a 3-5-2 at the moment, and the back line is the only thing I'm really worried about at the moment. I've got Cash absolutely fine against Forest, but then it's a doggy Chelsea. I do expect him to be home, to be back for that home game. And then it's Burn against Arsenal and Agard on the bench against Brentford away from home. I do also have Taylor against Crystal Palace at home, but I think Burnley are just so bad that even with a good fixture, I'm not convinced that I can start him. I've got 2 free transfers, so you can probably guess what I'm thinking. And that is going to be most likely Tsimikas for Aguerd. I do have, I don't need any money in the bank, but if Tsimikas rises tonight, which looks fairly likely, I will have that 0.1 in the bank to still make that move. So I don't need to make it tonight. But yeah, I could move a doggy out. I could move Burnout for Tsimikas instead, but I think Aguerd is probably the more obvious issue.
Definitely. You don't want that double West Ham defense, especially looking at the defensive numbers, do you?
Yeah, any week. Yeah, I to start with, I was looking when I wildcarded. I thought Aguerd might be a bit of a savvy pick. His goal threat's decent. West Ham had some good fixtures coming up, but now I'm looking at it and I'm thinking there is absolutely no week I want double exposure on a West Ham clean sheet. If they get one, fine, great. I've got Areola in goal anyway. I don't think I'd back them heavily enough to go double, so I might need to correct that error. And Tsimikas looks as good as anyone at 4.5 at the moment, absolutely. So I think it just makes sense.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense for sure. Maybe, there's definitely a few people questioning why did you buy Areola, and this is because of the money, isn't it? Like 4.2, no keepers cover themselves in glory. Like 4.2 for a 4.5 keeper, that's 0.3 million saving. Or if you bought him, if you had him from the start, a 0.5 million saving. Like shove him in, he'll get some saves. He got saves this week.
Yeah, there aren't many other good keepers at 4.5 either. Like even for the 0.3 that you could gain,
Johnston would be the one, wouldn't he? Really, if you're wildcarding now and you want to spend more money on a goalkeeper with those fixtures coming up we referenced earlier on. But I mean, West Ham's fixtures are still good, and there's a chance they're going to get a clean sheet out of those. I mean, it is David Moyes overall at 1 clean sheet over the first 10 games, which is going to bother him. So yeah, it'll be fine. It'll be fine. And Areola's got a decent amount of save points this season. So it's definitely something. I think he's averaging a 3 saves a game, 4 saves a game, something like that. So you're still getting what you want from a player of a goalkeeper of that cost. So team that's good. My team, I'm rolling. I think so. I haven't got a bench either. I've got Taylor, and FPL reviews telling me to play Taylor over Gordon. Don't think I'm going to quite do that.
Interesting.
I'm going to get the 2 free transfers and then figure out what the hell I'm going to do. Trippier and Gordon both play Bournemouth, of course, in game week 12.
12, yeah.
So if I did want to remove Trippier this week for Shimikas and free that money up for a move in 12, that is an option. And it's a case of kind of weighing up exactly what I'd do there if I did do that. I think I do want to get to Saka by game week 12 to have double up for Burnley at home. So that's something I really need to think about, especially because this week potentially does kind of form a good week to be removing Trippier and freeing that money up at the opportunity cost of missing out on 2 free transfers in game week 12, because I think it would be like Bowen to Saka would be what I do that week. And
oh, Tom, you're muted.
So yeah, there is a chance that I do Trippier to Shimikas this week, and basically just get that money released from Trippier. I think that I think it's a 50-50 chance that I do it, because I think that kind of just down in tools and rolling away may represent kind of the flip side of overmanagement that we spoke about earlier on. That maybe I'd be kind of just moving away from the process sort of works for me, because I've never been afraid to make transfers in a week where people kind of say, oh, you've got to roll, and it might kind of actually help to make that, because next week I may kind of be like, oh, I can't move Trippier now, whereas this week I sort of can. And Newcastle did look really leggy in that game, to be honest. Did not look like they're at the races, just because they've got loads of injuries and they've got a small team. We'll see what happens in the Carling Cup, wherever is it called, the Carling Cup now? Carabao Cup now. See what happens in that. But yes, I'm tempted to follow suit on Shimikas, because I think just releasing the money could lead to a lot of things going forward. But yes, it is at the opportunity cost of getting the 2 free transfers, but it may be a case of kind of needs must, just because I think maybe I think if I've got Martinelli, either he becomes then Saka, or in future Bowen becomes Saka, and I'll give up on Bowen, especially if Bowen this week is again West Ham continue their sort of fallow form. I mean, it's due to turn around at some point, that's for sure. But I mean, I think kind of if I can't get to Son, then I probably should try to get to Saka at least. So yeah, I'm kind of in two minds about it. It's definitely one that I'll leave until Friday. Don't like making moves on Saturday. It'll be probably one I think about until Friday, but that's kind of the one that I'm considering a lot at the moment. Maybe again also a route to the other one I'm thinking of is maybe removing Porro for Shimikas, but I don't think that's going to be enough to get Saka in on anyone else. So it may have to be Trippier who goes this week, but hey, I could just leave it and roll it. I mean, what do you think? I mean, do you think would you just kind of roll it and leave it, or do you think that there's definitely an element of, hey, you can sort that out and maybe kind of figure out how you get to Saka in 12? Because I think I'm going to need him for that Burnley game. I think it would be quite nice as well to have differential of potentially having Martinelli and Saka for that Burnley game.
Yeah, that would be nice. I do agree with that. I think either way you can get to Saka next week. I would just be hesitant about getting rid of Trippier ahead of that Bournemouth game next week. I can just see that backfiring in the same way that this week getting rid of Son did. And that's not to say it's not going to pay off. It could easily pay off as well. But I'm just trying to look at your side and see if there is another way to free up that money.
There's not.
It's not easy, is it?
No, it's genuinely not.
Could you? How much would Gordon to Adingra do? So that's another 0.6.
0.6, yeah. It's not good enough.
That wouldn't get you there.
No. Trippier needs to go at some point, and that's the only way I can do it. One to consider. That's for sure. We're not going to get to any answers here, but that is like barefaced the only way this week is probably the time to do it, because I expect Arsenal to score. Yes. It might be maybe one of those kind of butterfly effect decisions, which kind of at least I've got the money there, and at least then I've kind of moved to Saka, and then hey, I've got 2 Arsenal, and maybe again that could kind of be quite a good thing for the future. And long term, I definitely need to sort out my bench a little bit, because my bench is Taylor, Kabore, who's I think he played the full 90 versus Aston Villa actually, but he's kind of inability to register anything in terms of points is obviously worrying. And then Archer got benched. So I've got to sort my bench, especially for that game week coming up, for the midweek game week in December. I think it's game week 15. So I need a bench for that. So all of these things are hopefully going to help me going forward. So yeah, I think I'm kind of maybe even planning that, starting to plan that for now, and maybe looking at Shimakass. Oh, hey, even Harry Maguire. Hell, why not? Let's do it. Let's do it. Let's shoot for the moon. Shoot for the slab. Right. There we go. There we go.
There we go, indeed. Well, hopefully you've all enjoyed another quite long pod. Actually, we thought it would be a bit shorter today, but it's ended up being almost an hour and a half. So hopefully you've all hung in there with us and enjoyed our pod on overthinking. Hopefully we haven't overthought it today, and it's been enjoyable. But in the meantime, we have been Who Got the Assist. You can find us on X at WGTA_FPL, or myself at FPL Pricey, and on Instagram or Threads, it's WGTA.FPL or at FPL Pricey again. If you did enjoy the pod, if you could follow us on those channels, or give the pod a 5-star rating wherever you're listening to it. Or if you're watching on YouTube, we'd really appreciate it if you could leave a like and subscribe to the channel as well. That would be fantastic. Thank you so much in advance for doing any or all of those things.
Perfect. Thanks, Sam. We hope you enjoyed the pod. We hope we assisted you think about overmanagement, overthinking in FPL, and we'll speak to you next week. Take care.
Oh, it's a goal. Who got the assist? Who got the assist?
Oh, God.